It started like any other summer in the quiet suburb of Willow Creek. The neighborhood was calm, with rows of neatly lined houses, manicured lawns, and friendly faces exchanging morning greetings. It was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened, or so I thought. I had just moved into my new home, excited to begin a fresh chapter. Everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were polite but distant, except for one house at the end of the street. The house stood out, not because it was dilapidated or out of place, but because it felt off. The blinds were always drawn, the lawn overgrown, and no one ever seemed to come or go. It wasn't long before I met its occupant. One evening, as I was unloading groceries, I noticed a man standing across the street watching me. He was tall, with a lean build, wearing a faded gray hoodie. His face was pale, his eyes dark and sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't wave or smile, just stared. "Hello?" I called out, trying to be friendly. The man tilted his head slightly but didn't respond. Instead, he turned around and walked back toward the mysterious house at the end of the street. Something about him made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing strange things. At night, I'd hear faint scraping sounds coming from his direction, like someone dragging something heavy across the pavement. Once, I caught a glimpse of him standing in his yard, staring up at the night sky, completely still, even as the wind howled around him. Neighbors whispered rumors about him, though no one seemed to know his name. Some said he was a recluse who rarely left his home, while others believed he was hiding something. But the most chilling story came from an elderly woman who lived nearby. "He wasn't always there, you know," she said one morning as we chatted over the fence. "That house sat empty for years. Then one day he just appeared. No moving truck, no family, nothing. And ever since, strange things have been happening around here." At first I brushed off the rumors as small-town gossip, but the man's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. One evening, as I walked my dog past his house, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A single light flickered in an upstairs window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In one fleeting moment, I saw a figure, a shadowy outline of someone or something, standing perfectly still. Was it him? Or was it something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The unease began to seep into my daily life. Packages left on my porch were mysteriously moved or disappeared entirely. My dog, usually calm, refused to walk past his house anymore, growling low in his throat whenever we got too close. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And when I finally decided to investigate, I could never have prepared myself for what I would find. Little did I know, the nightmare was just beginning. The unease I felt about the man in the gray hoodie only grew stronger over time. The sounds, the strange occurrences, and the oppressive feeling of being watched were now a daily part of my life. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. At first I thought it might have been a raccoon knocking over a trash can, but as I listened closely, the sound repeated, closer this time. Thud. Thud. It was coming from the direction of the mysterious house at the end of the street. Curiosity got the better of me. I peeked out of my bedroom window, scanning the dark street for any sign of movement. That's when I saw him. The man was dragging a large, heavy object wrapped in what looked like a tarp. The streetlight flickered above him, casting eerie shadows that danced around him like specters. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He paused for a moment, glancing around as if to ensure no one was watching. My heart pounded as I ducked behind the curtain, praying he hadn't seen me. When I dared to look again, he was gone. And so was the top. The next morning, I convinced myself it could have been anything. Old furniture, garden waste, even a weird hobby project. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. What if it wasn't just junk? What if it was something or someone? A few days later, I found a dead bird on my porch. Its neck was twisted unnaturally, and its lifeless eyes stared up at me. My stomach churned as I picked it up with a gloved hand and disposed of it. Was this a coincidence, or was it some kind of message? That night, I decided to confront my fears head-on. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I ventured outside under the cover of darkness. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I made my way toward the man's house, every step filling me with dread. When I reached his property, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling onto the porch. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me first, a sickly metallic odor that made my stomach churn. The house was silent, save for the creaking floorboards beneath my feet. I shone my flashlight around, revealing sparse furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, their subjects blurred and indistinct. I ventured further, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. It was almost hypnotic, like the ticking of a clock. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave, but I pressed on. The staircase groaned under my weight as I ascended. The tapping grew louder, more erratic, until it stopped abruptly. I reached the top of the stairs and found myself in a dimly lit hallway. At the end was a door, slightly ajar, with light spilling out. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Inside was a small, cluttered room filled with bizarre objects. Rusty tools, jars filled with murky liquid, and an old tattered journal lying open on a desk. The walls were covered in strange symbols and scribbled notes, their meaning indecipherable. But what caught my attention most was the large wooden crate in the center of the room. It was sealed with heavy chains and padlocks, but faint scratches marred its surface, as if something inside had tried to claw its way out. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam flickered to life, I saw him standing in the doorway, the man in the gray hoodie. His eyes glinted with a malevolent gleam, and a twisted smile spread across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and guttural. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over the crate in the process. The chains rattled as the lid cracked open slightly, releasing a foul, putrid stench. From within, something moved, a shadowy, writhing mass that defied logic or reason. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room, the man's footsteps close behind. My only thought was to escape. I barreled down the stairs and out the front door, not daring to look back. As I reached the safety of my own home, I locked the doors and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I glanced out the window, expecting to see him coming after me, but the street was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head, questioning what I had seen. The crate, the man, the thing inside. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear. Whatever was in that house wasn't just the man's secret. It was something far darker, something that should never have been disturbed. The night after my escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow outside my window sent chills down my spine. Sleep was impossible. I stayed up, clutching my phone, ready to call for help if necessary. But the night passed without further incident. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I called the local authorities and reported everything I'd witnessed. The strange man, the noises, the crate. I told them all of it. At first, the officer on the phone seemed skeptical, but when I mentioned the house's history and the rumors surrounding it, he grew silent. "That house," he said finally, "has been a problem for years. You're not the first to report strange things. We'll send someone to check it out." Hours later, I watched from my window as 2 police cars pulled up in front of the man's house. The officers knocked on the door but got no response. They eventually forced their way inside. I held my breath, waiting to see what they would find. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. When the officers emerged, their faces were pale, their expressions grim. One of them carried a small evidence bag containing a tattered notebook, the same one I had seen on the desk. The other officer approached me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, "we've secured the house. The man you described is gone. There's no sign of him anywhere." "Gone?" I echoed, confused. "What about the crate? Did you open it?" The officer hesitated, glancing back at his partner. "The crate was empty," he said finally, "but there were scratches, deep ones. Whatever was in there is no longer there." A cold dread settled over me. "So what happens now?" "We'll conduct a thorough investigation," the officer replied. "But for now, we recommend you stay alert and avoid the house." It all started when I moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses were neatly aligned, the lawns perfectly trimmed, and the air carried a strange, almost eerie silence. I had always dreamed of living in a peaceful place like this, away from the chaos of the city. But I should have known. Things that look perfect often hide the darkest secrets. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, was an elderly woman in her late 60s. At first glance, she seemed harmless, with her warm smile and her constant offer of freshly baked cookies. But there was something unsettling about her piercing blue eyes. They felt too sharp, as if they could see right through you. It wasn't just her eyes that made me uneasy. Her house was the only one on the street that didn't seem to belong. While others had bright paint and colorful flowers, hers was an old, weathered structure with faded curtains always drawn shut. The once white picket fence was splintered and gray, and her front yard was overrun with thorny bushes. The first time I met her, I was unpacking boxes in my driveway. She appeared out of nowhere, her frail frame moving surprisingly quickly for someone her age. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "If you ever need anything, just let me know." I thanked her politely, but something about the way she lingered made me feel cold, despite the summer heat. Over the next few days, I began noticing things. At night, her house would glow faintly, as if lit by dozens of candles. Strange, muffled sounds echoed from her backyard. Whispers, maybe? I couldn't tell. At first, I dismissed it all as paranoia. New places always feel strange, right? But then, one evening, I found a package at my doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, with no name or note attached. Inside was a single withered rose and a key. That's when I realized Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just a lonely old woman. There was something much darker hiding behind her friendly smile. The package with the withered rose and the key haunted me for days. Who left it there? And why? My first instinct was to confront Mrs. Whitmore, but something inside me hesitated. Instead, I decided to ignore it, hoping it was just a harmless prank. But things started to escalate. Every night around midnight, I would hear faint knocking sounds coming from her direction. It wasn't loud, just a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone gently rapping on a wooden surface. At first I thought it was the wind, but the knocking was too deliberate, too precise. One night, I mustered the courage to peek through my curtains. Her house was dark, except for that faint flickering glow inside. But the strange part was her backyard. Shadows danced across the overgrown bushes, as if people were moving back there. I couldn't see anyone, but the whispers were unmistakable now. They were faint but persistent, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. Then there was the garden. During the day, I noticed something unusual. Mrs. Whitmore's yard was full of roses, hundreds of them. They weren't beautiful, vibrant roses, though. These were blackened and twisted, their petals curling as if burned. They stretched across her yard like veins, leading directly to a small, rusty shed in the corner. Curiosity got the better of me one afternoon. While pretending to water my plants, I wandered closer to the fence that separated our properties. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Whitmore was kneeling in the middle of her yard, digging into the earth with her bare hands. Her movements were frantic, almost animalistic, as if she was searching for something. "Can I help you with something?" Her voice was sharp and sudden, making me jump. She was standing now, her hands caked with dirt, her piercing eyes locked onto mine. I stammered an excuse about admiring her garden, but her expression didn't change. That night, I found another package at my door. This time, it contained a folded piece of paper with just 4 words scrawled across it. "Stay out of it." The whispers grew louder after that. The shadows in her backyard seemed to stretch further, crawling toward my house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in my own home. Mrs. Whitmore was hiding something I was terrified to uncover. The sleepless nights were taking their toll. Every time I tried to dismiss what I'd seen, something new would happen to pull me back into the nightmare. The whispers had grown louder, no longer confined to her yard. They seemed to seep through my walls, haunting me even in my dreams. One night, I decided I'd had enough. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone, I ventured out to her backyard. The air was cold and thick, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and settles in your bones. The faint glow from her windows cast long, eerie shadows across the thorny bushes. I followed the trail of blackened roses to the shed at the far end of her yard. Up close, the structure looked even more sinister. Its rusted metal door was covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols etched into the surface. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around to see Mrs. Whitmore standing just a few feet away. Her frail figure seemed taller, more imposing in the dim light. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned with something between rage and fear. I just heard noises," I stammered. "I thought someone might need help." She stepped closer, her movements unnaturally smooth. "You don't understand what you're meddling with. Leave. Now." Her voice was low and commanding, but something about her tone made me hesitate. There was fear in her voice, not for herself, but for me. For a moment, I considered turning back. But then I remembered the packages, the whispers, the shadows. Whatever was going on here, I had to know. I waited until she disappeared into the house before I returned to the shed. The key from the first package felt heavy in my pocket, as if it had been waiting for this moment. With a deep breath, I slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was damp and foul, like rotting earth. The small space was crammed with shelves holding jars filled with strange, murky liquids and objects I couldn't identify. In the center of the room was a table covered in old, faded photographs and handwritten notes. But what caught my eye was a single black candle burning at the center of the table, its flame flickering unnaturally. As I stepped closer, I noticed the photographs were of the neighborhood, houses, families, and most disturbingly, me. There were multiple photos of me in my home, taken from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Suddenly, the candle's flame flared violently, and the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The shed shook, and I stumbled backward, knocking over a jar that shattered on the ground. Thick black liquid seeped out, and as it touched the floor, it began to move, crawling toward me like it was alive. Panicked, I ran out of the shed, slamming the door behind me. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting for me on the porch, her expression unreadable. "I warned you," she said softly, her voice carrying a chilling finality. That's when I realized this wasn't just about her. Whatever I had disturbed wasn't something natural. It was something ancient and malevolent. And now, it was coming for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind felt like a warning. My house didn't feel like my own anymore. It felt alive, breathing, watching me. And then, at exactly midnight, it began. The whispers returned, but this time, they were inside my home. They were louder, clearer, and filled with an anger I could feel in my chest. Shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes. My lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and moved cautiously toward the living room, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the room was a figure, a tall, shadowy form with eyes that glowed like embers. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers grew deafening. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, layered over one another, spoken in a language I couldn't understand. The shadows on the walls began to swirl, converging toward the figure, making it grow larger, darker, more solid. And then it spoke. A single word, guttural and cold, that felt like it was ripping through my very soul. "Leave." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the furniture. My mind raced. I had to get out of the house. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed firmly shut. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel, mocking laughter that seemed to come from every direction. The figure began to move toward me, its form shifting and twisting unnaturally. Desperate, I remembered the key from the shed. It was still in my pocket, heavy and cold. I ran upstairs to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. On my desk was the package with the withered rose. The rose seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Without thinking, I grabbed it and held it out like a weapon. The laughter stopped abruptly. the figure appeared on the other side of the door, its glowing eyes piercing through the wood. It didn't break in. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. The whispers began again, softer this time, almost pleading.